Welcome to Historical Legacies. Here, we dive into history's most intriguing stories, unraveling mysteries, and uncovering truths from the past. Subscribe to join our journey through time's greatest moments. Puyi, the last emperor's fall and redemption. Introduction. Puyi, the last emperor of China, was a man caught between two worlds, born into imperial splendor, but destined for a life of exile, manipulation, and ultimately, redemption. His story is not just the tale of a fallen ruler, but a mirror reflecting China's tumultuous transformation from a feudal empire to a modern communist state. Ascending the throne at just 2 years old in 1908, Puyi ruled as the Xuantong Emperor of the Qing Dynasty before being forced to abdicate in 1912 when the dynasty crumbled. But his fall was far from immediate. As China struggled with warlords, revolutions, and foreign interventions, Puyi remained a symbolic figure, desperately clinging to power in various forms, first within the Forbidden City, then as a puppet ruler under Japanese control in Manchukuo. His decisions, whether made out of desperation or ambition, would tie him to some of history's most controversial events. Yet perhaps the most remarkable part of Puyi's life was not his rise, but his transformation. After World War II, he was captured by the Soviets and later handed over to Communist China, where he underwent re-education in a labor camp. Stripped of his former identity, he emerged as an ordinary citizen under Mao's rule, living a humble life as a gardener in Beijing. His journey from the dragon throne to a common worker symbolizes not only personal redemption, but also the irreversible changes in Chinese society. This documentary will explore the complex life of Puyi in 15 chapters, following his incredible journey from emperor to exile, from a pawn of foreign powers to a reformed man in a new China. Through his story, we uncover the rise and fall of an empire and a man who witnessed it all. Part 1. The Child Emperor, Puyi's rise to the throne. The Qing Dynasty in crisis. The once mighty empire stood on the edge of collapse, weakened by decades of corruption, failed reforms, and growing resentment from the Han majority. Foreign encroachment, particularly by Western powers and Japan, had further destabilized the dynasty, forcing China into humiliating treaties and economic decline. The internal turmoil reached its peak when Emperor Guangxu died in 1908, leaving the imperial court in disarray. A sudden coronation. In a desperate bid to maintain Manchu rule, powerful court officials hastily selected a successor. Puyi, the 2-year-old son of Prince Chun, was chosen as the new emperor, officially ascending the throne as the Xuantong Emperor. The decision was not based on his capabilities, but rather on political necessity, as an older ruler might have challenged the influence of the regents and Empress Dowager Longyu, who now wielded real power. His coronation was a grand spectacle, filled with elaborate rituals designed to uphold the illusion of stability. Yet beneath the golden splendor, the empire was crumbling. The Forbidden City as a gilded cage. Isolated from the outside world, Puyi's early years were confined within the vast walls of the Forbidden City. He was surrounded by eunuchs, court officials, and royal tutors who dictated every aspect of his existence. Raised to believe in his divine right to rule, he had no understanding of the revolutionary storm gathering beyond the palace gates. His every need was attended to with rigid protocol, yet the vast emptiness of his world was suffocating. The abdication looms. As the 1911 revolution erupted, led by Sun Yat-sen and his republican forces, the imperial court struggled to contain the uprising. Provincial governors declared independence from the Qing government, further weakening its grip on power. Facing inevitable defeat, Empress Dowager Longyu, acting as regent, negotiated with Yuan Shikai, a powerful military leader, to secure a peaceful transition. The role of court officials and regents. While Puyi sat on the throne, the real power rested with those around him. Empress Dowager Longyu was crucial in managing the final days of Qing rule, but she faced immense pressure from both reformists and die-hard loyalists. Meanwhile, Yuan Shikai maneuvered for his own advantage, promising to protect the emperor while secretly working to establish his own authority. Puyi's isolated upbringing. Despite being an emperor, Puyi had little agency in his own life. His days were dictated by rigid court traditions, and any deviation was met with strict discipline. The eunuchs who cared for him wielded significant influence, often manipulating situations for their own gain. As he grew older, he would come to resent the control imposed upon him, the burden of an unwanted crown. As a toddler, Puyi could not comprehend his role, yet the weight of an empire rested on his small shoulders. He was paraded before officials as a symbol of the Qing's last attempt to hold on to power, though even the palace servants knew it was feudal. The illusion of authority did not shield him from the political realities that would soon remove him from the throne. Signs of an inevitable collapse. Even within the Forbidden City, whispers of rebellion could not be silenced. Servants and officials secretly prepared for the dynasty's fall, while outside, the revolution gained momentum. By early 1912, it became evident that the Qing dynasty had no future. Internal conflicts within the palace. The court was divided between those who wished to resist and those who saw abdication as the only path forward. While some Qing loyalists urged a last stand, others, including Empress Dowager Longyu, saw no choice but to surrender power. The emperor's fate was being decided without his knowledge. The young emperor struggled to understand power. Puyi, too young to grasp the political crisis, experienced these events through the anxiety of those around him. He could sense the fear and urgency in the palace, yet no one explained what was happening. His rule had begun with grandeur, but it would soon end in forced abdication. Part 2. The Fall of the Qing Dynasty. Forced abdication at age 6. The Qing Dynasty, once a symbol of absolute power, stood at the precipice of collapse. For over 2.5 centuries, the dynasty had ruled over China, but the dawn of the 20th century brought unrest, foreign intervention, and internal corruption that weakened the imperial structure. The burden of centuries-old traditions and the growing resistance against the monarchy made its downfall inevitable. As the tides of revolution surged, the fate of the dynasty fell upon the shoulders of a child, Emperor Puyi. In 1908, at the tender age of 2, Puyi was thrust onto the dragon throne following the death of the Xuantong Emperor. Too young to comprehend the magnitude of his title, he was nothing more than a puppet controlled by the imperial court. The real power rested in the hands of Empress Dowager Cixi's successor, Empress Dowager Longyu, and the regents who sought to preserve the crumbling empire. But outside the palace walls, the people of China had lost faith in the Qing rule. Poverty, economic instability, and years of humiliation at the hands of foreign powers had pushed the nation to the brink of revolution. By 1911, the Xinhai Revolution erupted, led by Republican forces determined to dismantle imperial rule. The uprising quickly gained momentum as soldiers and civilians turned against the dynasty. City by city, province by province, Qing authority crumbled, and the ruling elite found themselves besieged by forces demanding an end to monarchy. The final blow came when Yuan Shikai, the powerful general who had once served the Qing court, abandoned his loyalty to the dynasty and sided with the revolutionaries. With no military strength to suppress the rebellion, the court was left with no option but to negotiate. On February 12, 1912, the fate of the Qing dynasty was sealed. Empress Dowager Longyu, acting on behalf of the 6-year-old emperor, issued the Abdication Edict, officially bringing an end to over 2,000 years of imperial rule. The document stated that while Puyi would step down as emperor, he would be allowed to retain his imperial title and privileges. The new Republic of China, led by Sun Yat-sen, permitted him to reside within the Forbidden City and receive a generous stipend. Though he was no longer the ruler of China, Puyi remained within the confines of the palace, oblivious to the political storm that had swept away his empire. Inside the Forbidden City, life continued as if nothing had changed. The young emperor still followed imperial traditions, performed rituals, and was attended by eunuchs and concubines who upheld the illusion of his rule. To Puyi, the golden halls and vast courtyards were still his kingdom, untouched by the chaos unfolding beyond the palace walls. However, the reality outside was starkly different. China was now a republic, but it was a nation struggling to find stability amid internal conflict, warlordism, and foreign interference. Despite his abdication, Puyi remained a figure of both reverence and concern. Monarchist factions still viewed him as a potential symbol for restoration, while Republican leaders saw him as a lingering threat to their authority. His very existence was a political dilemma that could not be ignored. Over time, the privileges granted to him would be questioned, and his position in the Forbidden City would become increasingly precarious. The fall of the Qing Dynasty was just the beginning of his journey, a journey that would take him from a secluded child emperor to a man caught in the relentless tides of history. Part 3. A Prisoner in the Forbidden City. Life Behind the Red Walls. The great bronze doors of the Forbidden City shut behind Puyi, sealing him within a world untouched by time. The vast courtyards, once alive with imperial ceremonies, now echoed with silence. Though he still held the title of emperor, it was nothing more than a hollow illusion. Outside the palace walls, China was changing, shifting towards a new era that no longer had a place for dynasties. But inside, life remained frozen in the rituals of the past, with Puyi at its center, both ruler and captive. Each morning, he was dressed in imperial robes, attended by the few remaining eunuchs and servants who still upheld ancient customs. They knelt before him, speaking in hushed tones, fearing any deviation from the traditions that had governed their lives for centuries. Yet behind their obedience lay uncertainty. The Forbidden City was no longer the seat of power. It was a relic, slowly eroding under the weight of a forgotten empire. Puyi's childhood passed in rigid isolation. His tutors drilled him in Confucian philosophy, court etiquette, and the histories of his ancestors, but none of it prepared him for the world beyond the red walls. Forbidden from interacting with commoners, he grew up detached from reality, believing that one day he would reclaim his rightful rule. The only glimpses of the changing world came through newspapers and radio reports smuggled in by attendants, whispering of revolutions, warlords, and the Republic of China's growing power. Yet the most insidious threat came from within. Court politics, once the lifeblood of the Qing Dynasty, had decayed into schemes for survival. The eunuchs, once powerful intermediaries, resorted to bribery and theft, smuggling priceless artifacts from the palace to sell in the outside world. Puyi, still naive to the deception around him, began to notice the slow disappearance of treasures that had once adorned the grand halls. His authority was slipping even within the confines of his prison. By the time he reached adolescence, frustration turned to defiance. He dismissed long-serving eunuchs, believing he could restore order, but each decision only deepened the chaos. His own servants resented him, and his few allies dwindled. The Forbidden City, which had once represented supreme power, now felt like an empty shell, its grandeur a cruel reminder of his helplessness. Outside, warlords carved up China, each vying for dominance in the unstable republic. The Emperor of China had become a forgotten title, and Puyi was little more than a shadow of the past. The Beijing government, wary of his lingering influence, grew impatient with his presence. In 1924, everything changed. General Feng Yuxiang, a warlord with growing ambitions, staged a coup in Beijing and took control of the capital. He issued an ultimatum. Puyi was to leave the Forbidden City immediately. The boy who had once been worshipped as the son of heaven now found himself cast out, his power reduced to nothing. As he was escorted out of the palace under armed guard, he turned back for one final glance. The towering red walls that had once shielded him now stood as barriers to a past he could never return to. The Forbidden City was no longer his home. The last emperor had become a man without a throne. Part 4. Fleeing the palace. Exile in Tianjin and the search for power. The gates of the Forbidden City closed behind Puyi, and for the first time in his life, he stepped into a world beyond the imperial walls. The city he had once ruled was no longer his kingdom. Escorted under armed guard, he was taken to the residence of his father, Prince Chun, where he remained under house arrest. But Puyi refused to accept his fate. Even without a throne, he still saw himself as emperor, clinging to the belief that his exile was temporary. A year later, with the help of loyal retainers and foreign diplomats, he escaped Beijing under the protection of the Japanese. Disguised in civilian clothes, he was smuggled out of the city and taken to Tianjin, a bustling coastal metropolis under the influence of multiple foreign powers. There, within the walls of the Japanese concession, he found refuge in the stately Zhang Garden, a Western-style villa far removed from the rigid traditions of the Forbidden City. Tianjin was a city unlike any Puyi had ever known. British, French, Japanese, and other foreign communities lived alongside Chinese warlords and nationalist factions, each vying for control. It was a place of intrigue, diplomacy, and shifting allegiances. Yet even in this new environment, Puyi refused to see himself as an exile. He maintained an imperial court within his residence, demanding that his servants address him as Your Majesty and treating his estate as if it were still an imperial palace. But outside the villa, the world was moving forward without him. The Republic of China was consolidating power, and warlords who once played politics with the idea of restoring the Qing Dynasty began abandoning their support. Puyi sent secret appeals to various factions, pleading for assistance in reclaiming the throne, but each request was met with polite refusal or empty promises. His name still carried weight, but only as a tool for others to use, not as a true ruler. Among those watching him closely was the Japanese government. Seeing him as a potential asset, Japanese intelligence agents cultivated a relationship with the exiled emperor, offering him protection and support. At first, Puyi was wary. He had no great love for Japan, whose forces had once humiliated China in war. But as his options dwindled, the promises of the Japanese grew more appealing. They spoke of a grand plan, one where Puyi would once again wear the imperial robes, not in Beijing, but in Manchuria, the land of his ancestors. It was a dangerous proposition. Manchuria had been seized by the Japanese in 1931 and was now under their control. They sought to establish a puppet state, one that would legitimize their rule while maintaining the illusion of Chinese sovereignty. Puyi, desperate to regain power, convinced himself that this was his opportunity. He saw it not as submission, but as a strategic step toward reclaiming China. In 1932, after years of exile, Puyi left Tianjin aboard a Japanese military aircraft bound for Manchuria. As the plane soared over the Chinese countryside, he felt a surge of hope. The world had taken his empire from him once, but now, he believed, he was on the brink of reclaiming it. He had no idea that he was flying straight into another prison. Part 5. Puppet of the Rising Sun, Puyi and the Manchukuo Experiment. The roar of the Japanese military aircraft faded as Puyi stepped onto Manchurian soil. The icy wind bit through his clothing, but he hardly noticed. Before him stood a delegation of Japanese officials, their uniforms crisp, their bows respectful. They addressed him as Your Majesty, their voices filled with calculated reverence. For the first time since his exile, he felt like an emperor again. But beneath the polished ceremony, the chains of his new captivity were already tightening. Puyi was escorted to Changchun, the renamed capital of Manchukuo. The city, once a Chinese stronghold, was now a carefully crafted facade of Japanese rule. The streets were lined with banners proclaiming the dawn of a new empire, one that existed only in name. The Japanese had created Manchukuo as a puppet state, and Puyi was to be its figurehead. In March 1932, he was formally installed as chief executive, a title that fell far short of the emperor he longed to be. But the Japanese assured him this was only temporary, a stepping stone to full imperial restoration. The reality became clear almost immediately. Every decision, every decree, every aspect of governance was controlled by Tokyo. Japanese advisors monitored his actions, dictated policies, and ensured that Manchukuo served Japan's imperial ambitions. Puyi's court was filled with spies, and his movements were restricted. When he tried to appoint Chinese officials loyal to him, they were quickly removed or sidelined. His throne, draped in the symbols of Manchu heritage, was nothing more than an elaborate prop. Still, Puyi clung to the illusion of power. In 1934, he was given a grand coronation, officially declared Emperor of Manchukuo. Dressed in flowing imperial robes, he performed ancient rituals before an audience of dignitaries and military officers. The golden dragon insignia adorned his banners, and the anthems of his empire echoed through the halls. But beyond the palace walls, the people of Manchuria knew the truth. This was not a restoration of sovereignty, but an extension of Japanese rule. As the years passed, Puyi's frustration deepened. He was isolated, manipulated, and increasingly paranoid. He resented the Japanese officers who treated him with barely concealed condescension. Any attempt to assert himself was ignored or met with veiled threats. He was surrounded by luxury, yet he was powerless, an emperor only in title, held captive in a golden cage. Outside his court, Manchukuo became a brutal occupation zone. The Japanese exploited its vast resources, using forced labor and military crackdowns to maintain control. Resistance movements formed in the countryside, battling against the occupation. But Puyi was shielded from these realities. His Japanese handlers ensured that he saw only carefully curated reports, painting Manchukuo as a thriving and loyal state. Yet deep inside, he knew he was nothing more than a pawn. He had willingly stepped into this role, believing it was a path to reclaiming his legacy. Now he realized he had traded one prison for another. The Forbidden City had been a gilded cage of ancient rituals. Manchukuo was a farce built on the ambitions of a foreign empire. And soon the world would turn against him once more. Part 6. The Illusion of Power. Life as the emperor of a Japanese puppet state. Puyi sat upon his throne in Chongchun, but the weight of his crown felt heavier with each passing year. Manchukuo, the empire he had been promised, was little more than a mirage, a stage upon which he played the role of sovereign while the real ruler sat in Tokyo. Every decree he signed, every ceremony he performed, was orchestrated by unseen hands. He had yearned for power, yet found himself more powerless than ever. At first, he had convinced himself that patience was the key. He believed that if he proved his loyalty to Japan, he would eventually be granted true authority. But the illusion shattered quickly. His ministers, handpicked by Japanese officials, answered not to him, but to their superiors in the Guangdong army. His palace was filled with spies, his own words monitored and reported. Even his daily schedule was dictated by his advisors, who ensured that his movements and decisions aligned with Japan's imperial agenda. Puyi's frustration turned to paranoia. He began to suspect his closest attendants of working against him, and in many cases, he was right. The Japanese had no intention of letting him rule independently. He was a symbol, a carefully controlled figure meant to give legitimacy to their occupation of Manchuria. The people of Manchukuo did not see him as a liberator. They saw him as a traitor, a willing collaborator of a foreign power that had stripped their land of its sovereignty. The once proud emperor became withdrawn, seeking refuge in elaborate ceremonies and rigid traditions. He clung to the rituals of his ancestors, desperate to maintain the illusion of imperial dignity. But even within the palace, he was met with cold indifference. Japanese officials barely concealed their disdain for him, treating him as an inconvenience rather than a ruler. Every time he attempted to assert authority, he was met with polite dismissal or thinly veiled threats. By the late 1930s, Japan's war machine had expanded, dragging China and much of Asia into brutal conflict. Puyi watched from his isolated palace as the full scale of Japan's ambitions unfolded. He was told to support Tokyo's military campaigns, to praise Japan's leadership, to remain silent about the suffering inflicted upon his own people. He obeyed, though deep inside, he felt a growing unease. His personal life fared no better. His marriage to Wanrong, once filled with fragile hope, crumbled under the weight of their circumstances. Wanrong, disillusioned and trapped in the same prison of powerlessness, spiraled into opium addiction, her days passing in a haze of despair. Puyi, unable to help her, withdrew further into his isolation, his mind consumed by resentment and regret. He had believed that Manchukuo was his path back to power. Now he saw it for what it truly was, a hollow empire, built on lies and maintained through force. He was an emperor without control, a ruler without a nation, a prisoner once more. And soon, the walls of his empire would collapse. Part 7. World War II and the Collapse of Manchukuo. By the early 1940s, the world was engulfed in war, and Manchukuo stood at the center of Japan's imperial ambitions. Puyi, still draped in the illusion of sovereignty, watched as his so-called empire became a staging ground for Japan's military conquests. The vast resources of Manchuria, its coal, steel, and farmlands, were exploited to fuel the Japanese war machine. Its people, once promised prosperity, were now subject to forced labor, military conscription, and brutal repression. But within the high walls of his palace in Changchun, Puyi remained a spectator, powerless to change the tide of history. At first, he tried to maintain the illusion that his rule still mattered. But with every passing month, it became clearer that Manchukuo was nothing more than a military outpost. Japanese officers openly disregarded his authority, and his own ministers no longer looked to him for leadership. Anti-Japanese resistance movements intensified, carrying out daring raids against the occupiers. Many of Puyi's own people saw him not as an emperor, but as a traitor who had sold Manchuria to foreign invaders. Despite this, Puyi clung to the hope that Japan would eventually grant him true power. But Japan had no such intentions. By 1944, as the Pacific War turned against them, the Japanese began withdrawing their best troops from Manchukuo to defend their homeland. The once mighty Guangdong army, which had kept Puyi's regime in place, was severely weakened. His empire was now exposed, vulnerable to attack, and all but abandoned by those who had once controlled him. Then, in August 1945, the final blow fell. The Soviet Union, honoring its pact with the Allies, launched a massive invasion of Manchukuo. Within days, the Red Army shattered Japanese defenses, sweeping across the region with unstoppable force. Japanese forces, once so confident in their supremacy, collapsed under the assault. Entire battalions surrendered without a fight, while others were wiped out in brutal engagements. Manchukuo, the empire Puyi had once dreamed would restore his legacy, collapsed like a house of cards. Inside his palace, panic erupted. Japanese officials fled, abandoning their posts, while Puyi and his remaining court scrambled for an escape. His most trusted advisors whispered conflicting advice. Some urged him to surrender, others to flee to Japan. But there was no clear path to salvation. Tokyo itself was on the brink of surrender, and Japan's leaders had no concern for Manchukuo's doomed emperor. As Soviet tanks rumbled toward Changchun, Puyi found himself paralyzed with fear. He had spent his life believing he was destined to rule, yet now, stripped of his illusions, he was just another fugitive trying to escape the ruins of war. In a last desperate attempt, he rushed to an airfield, hoping to board a plane to Japan. Dressed in civilian clothes, he waited for the aircraft to take off, clutching onto the final shred of hope that he might still be rescued. But before he could flee, Soviet troops stormed the airfield. The last emperor of China, once the ruler of a vast and ancient dynasty, was now a prisoner of war. And this time there would be no palace to return to. Part 8. Captured by the Soviets. A fallen emperor in a foreign land. Puyi sat in stunned silence as Soviet soldiers surrounded him. The airfield, once his last hope for escape, had become the site of his downfall. Moments earlier, he had been preparing to flee to Japan, still clinging to the belief that his former allies would save him. Now, he was nothing more than a captured fugitive, stripped of his title and authority. The last emperor of China had become a prisoner of war. Dragged from the airstrip, Puyi was taken under heavy guard to a secure Soviet facility. He had spent his life surrounded by attendants, ministers, and military officials who spoke to him with deference, but now no one bowed. The Soviet officers treated him not as an emperor, not even as an important political figure, but as just another detainee. It was a humiliation unlike anything he had ever known. Days later, he and his entourage, including his brother Puyi, were flown to the Soviet Union. The journey was bleak. Gone were the days of luxury, of silk robes and grand palaces. He was given simple clothes, basic food, and no special treatment. Arriving in the Soviet Union, he was placed in a heavily guarded detention center in Chita, deep in Siberia. The once mighty ruler of Manchukuo now found himself confined within cold, barren walls, his future uncertain. At first, Puyi struggled to comprehend his new reality. He had always been a man controlled by others, first the Qing court, then the Japanese, but at least then he had been given the illusion of power. Now, even that was gone. The Soviets questioned him for hours on end, pressing him for details about Japan's occupation of Manchuria, the inner workings of his puppet regime, and his role in the war. He answered cautiously, unsure of what they wanted to hear. He was terrified of being handed over to the Chinese communists, knowing they saw him as a traitor to his own people. Months passed, then years. While other Japanese officials and military officers were gradually repatriated, Puyi remained in Soviet custody. His fate was a delicate issue. Stalin saw him as a valuable bargaining chip in post-war diplomacy, and Mao Zedong viewed him as a political tool for the new China. For Puyi, it was a time of powerlessness and fear. He had no idea if he would ever be free again or if he would be put on trial for crimes he had no real control over. Despite his status as a prisoner, Puyi was treated with relative care compared to other detainees. He was not subjected to physical torture, nor was he thrown into forced labor. Instead, he was kept in isolation, given books to read, and even allowed occasional walks. But none of it could ease the crushing weight of his disgrace. He spent long hours reflecting on his life, questioning the choices he had made, the trust he had placed in the Japanese, and the consequences of his actions. By 1949, the world around him had changed forever. The Chinese Civil War had ended, and Mao Zedong's communist forces had established the People's Republic of China. The country Puyi had once ruled was now under a government that viewed him as nothing more than a relic of a bygone era, a living reminder of feudalism, imperialism, and foreign manipulation. His return to China was inevitable, but what awaited him there was a fate more uncertain than any he had faced before. Then, in 1950, the Soviets made their decision. Puyi was to be handed over to the new communist government. He had feared this moment for years, dreading what punishment the communists might inflict upon him. Would he be executed as a symbol of the old China, sent to a labor camp to die in obscurity? He had no answers, only the growing realization that he was about to face the judgment of a nation that no longer had a place for an emperor. His time in Soviet custody had come to an end, but his journey was far from over. Part 9. Return to China, facing the communist regime. In the cold spring of 1950, Puyi was escorted to a Soviet military aircraft. The moment he had feared for years had finally arrived. The Soviets, having used him as a bargaining chip in post-war diplomacy, were handing him over to the newly established People's Republic of China. He had no idea what awaited him. Trial, execution, or perhaps a lifetime in a labor camp. Whatever lay ahead, one thing was certain. The last emperor of China was returning to a country that no longer wanted him. As the plane touched down in Shenyang, a city he had once known under Japanese rule, Puyi felt a deep sense of dread. The China he had left behind was gone, replaced by a revolutionary state that sought to erase everything he had once represented. At the airstrip, he was met not by executioners, but by a detachment of communist officials and soldiers. They showed no signs of hostility, nor did they offer him deference. He was no longer an emperor, no longer even a prisoner of the Soviets. He was simply a detainee of the Chinese state. Under heavy guard, he was transported to Fushan War Criminals Management Center, a facility designed to reform former nationalist officials, Japanese collaborators, and war criminals. Puyi expected the worst. He had spent years fearing that the communists would put him on trial, parade him through the streets in public humiliation, or execute him as a traitor. Instead, he found himself placed in a cell, given food, books, and assigned a daily routine. It was a prison, but not the brutal labor camp he had imagined. At first, Puyi refused to believe the situation was real. He had seen so many betrayals, so many shifting tides of power, that he assumed the communists were simply keeping him alive for a show trial. He barely spoke, his mind clouded with anxiety and uncertainty. But as days turned into months and no such trial came, he began to see that his captors had a different plan. The communists were not interested in punishing Puyi in the traditional sense. They wanted to remake him. They saw him as a product of the old China, a living relic of feudalism and imperialism. He was not to be executed, but re-educated. Every day, he was required to read communist literature, write confessions detailing his past crimes, and attend sessions where he was made to confront the consequences of his rule. He listened as former subjects, Manchurians who had suffered under Japanese occupation, recounted their hardships. He heard stories of forced labor, of families torn apart, of betrayals and suffering, all under the empire he had ruled in name. At first, he resisted. He insisted that he had only ever done what was necessary to survive, that he had been a mere figurehead, powerless under Japanese control. But his interrogators pushed him further. Was he truly innocent? Had he never benefited from his position? Had he not at every step chosen to align himself with those who offered him power, regardless of the cost? The questions lingered in his mind, chipping away at the fragile justifications he had clung to for so long. Over time, the rigid arrogance that had once defined him began to erode. For the first time in his life, Puyi was forced to look at himself not as a victim of fate, but as a man who had made choices that had led to suffering for millions. It was a slow, painful transformation. He wrote endless confessions, admitting to his role as a collaborator, acknowledging his failures, and confronting the reality that he had spent his entire life as a pawn of greater powers. By the mid-1950s, Puyi was no longer the man who had once clung to the dream of restoring an empire. The process of re-education had reshaped him. He no longer spoke of being an emperor, nor did he demand special treatment. He learned to plant crops, to clean his cell, to live as an ordinary prisoner among others who had also been deemed enemies of the new China. But what did the Communist Party ultimately plan for him? Would they ever allow the last emperor to walk free? That question remained unanswered. For now, he could only wait. Part 10. The Struggle of Re-Education. From Emperor to Prisoner. Puyi had spent his life being served, obeyed, and revered. Now, in the Fushan War Criminals Management Center, he was just another prisoner. The last emperor of China, once a symbol of divine rule, found himself scrubbing floors, growing vegetables, and washing his own clothes. It was a stark reversal of fortune, one that stripped away every illusion of privilege he had ever known. Re-education was relentless. It was not just physical labor, but a psychological transformation designed to break down the old and rebuild the new. Each day, Puyi was required to write self-criticisms, long, detailed confessions of his past crimes and ideological failings. He sat in group sessions where fellow prisoners, many of them former officials from Manchukuo, were expected to admit their mistakes and denounce their old loyalties. Some resisted, refusing to let go of their former beliefs. Others, broken by years of guilt and interrogation, embraced the communist ideology as their only path to survival. At first, Puyi struggled to conform. He had spent years justifying his decisions, telling himself he had been powerless under the Japanese, that he had done what he must to survive. But his interrogators refused to accept such answers. They forced him to look at his role not as a victim, but as an accomplice. Had he not lived in luxury while his people suffered? Had he not signed orders, given speeches, and played the part of an emperor while Japan exploited Manchuria? The weight of these questions pressed down on him. At night, he lay awake in his cold prison bed, replaying his past in his mind. He thought of the Forbidden City, of the courtiers who had once bowed to him. He thought of Manchukuo, the palace in Chongchun, the Japanese advisors who had once surrounded him. He had been a ruler in name, but had he ever truly ruled? The answer was becoming painfully clear. As the years passed, Puyi changed. He stopped demanding special treatment. He no longer clung to the belief that he was destined for power. He read Marxist literature, memorized the words of Mao Zedong, and slowly, he began to reshape his own identity. The arrogance that had once defined him faded, replaced by something new, humility, or perhaps simply exhaustion. The prison guards noticed his transformation. Unlike other inmates who resisted, who longed for the past, Puyi showed genuine signs of change. He no longer saw himself as the center of the universe. He learned to work alongside others, to speak as an equal rather than as a ruler. Yet doubts lingered. Was this true change or merely survival? Was he embracing the communist ideology out of belief, or because he knew it was his only chance at freedom? Perhaps even he did not know. By the late 1950s, whispers spread that some prisoners might be released. The Communist Party, now firmly in control of China, saw value in showing mercy to those who had successfully reformed. But could the last emperor of China ever truly be free? For now, Puyi could do nothing but continue his struggle for redemption, one confession, one lesson, one labor-filled day at a time. Part 11. A citizen of the People's Republic, Puyi's new identity. The gates of Fushun War Criminals Management Center loomed before Puyi. He had spent nearly a decade within its walls, stripped of his former identity, reshaped by relentless re-education. Now, in 1959, a stunning announcement changed everything. He was to be released. The last emperor of China, once the ruler of millions, was about to step into a world where he was just an ordinary man. The decision came as part of a larger policy under Mao Zedong's government. On the 10th anniversary of the People's Republic of China, the state granted amnesty to select war criminals who had demonstrated sincere reform. Among them was Puyi. His transformation from a feudal ruler to a humbled, self-critical citizen had convinced the authorities that he was no longer a threat to the new China. But what was he now? If he was no longer an emperor, no longer a prisoner, then who was he? As he stepped out of the prison gates, Puyi was not greeted by crowds or fanfare. There was no grand return, no restoration of dignity. Instead, he was escorted to Beijing under the careful watch of communist officials, beginning the next uncertain chapter of his life. The government had arranged work for him, his first real job. He was assigned as a gardener at the Beijing Botanical Garden. The irony was striking. The man who had once been the son of heaven, who had ruled from the dragon throne, now tended to plants and pulled weeds. But he did not protest. He accepted his role, understanding that this was the only way forward. Life as a common citizen was an adjustment unlike any he had faced before. He moved into a small, state-assigned apartment, living among ordinary workers. There were no servants, no royal court, no advisors whispering in his ear. For the first time in his life, he had to learn basic survival skills, buying groceries, cooking food, and managing daily tasks on his own. It was both humiliating and liberating. He was finally free, yet bound by a life he had never been prepared for. Despite the radical change, Puyi found moments of peace in his new routine. The simple act of tending to flowers, of watching plants grow under his care, gave him a quiet satisfaction he had never known in the palaces of his youth. He befriended fellow workers, people who had never known him as an emperor, only as a man trying to start over. Some were wary of him, others curious, but gradually, he became just another face in the city. Even so, the past never fully disappeared. He was a living relic of a bygone era, and the Communist Party carefully monitored him, ensuring he remained loyal to his reformed identity. Occasionally, he was called upon to give talks about his transformation, speaking of the evils of imperial rule and the wisdom of the communist revolution. He recited these lines dutifully, understanding that his survival depended on staying in the party's favor. Whether he truly believed them or not was a question only he could answer. Over time, Puyi even found companionship. Under government guidance, he married a nurse named Li Xuxian, a woman with no ties to nobility or the past regime. Their marriage was far from a grand imperial union. It was simple, pragmatic, and arranged to help him integrate further into society. Yet, in a way, it marked the final step in his transformation. He was no longer a ruler, no longer even a prisoner. He was a citizen of the People's Republic of China. But could he ever truly escape his past? As he walked the streets of Beijing, he sometimes caught whispers, lingering glances from those who recognized him. To some, he was a traitor. To others, a tragic figure. And to the state, he was a tool, proof that even the most privileged could be remade under communist rule. His life as an ordinary citizen had begun. But the shadows of his past would never fully fade. Part 12. The Last Years, from Imperial Majesty to Ordinary Worker. Puyi's final years were a quiet echo of a life once lived in unimaginable grandeur. The man who had been the son of heaven, the ruler of the Qing Dynasty, the puppet emperor of Manchukuo, and a prisoner of war now lived a modest, almost invisible existence. There were no more royal robes, no palaces, no servants waiting on his every command. Instead, there was a small apartment in Beijing, a government-issued job, and the daily routine of an ordinary worker. His days were spent tending to plants at the Beijing Botanical Garden, pruning trees, watering flowers, and learning the delicate patience required of a gardener. It was an occupation far removed from the political intrigues and imperial rituals that had once consumed his life. Yet, in this simplicity, he found something resembling peace. He took pride in watching the seasons change, in the quiet growth of the plants under his care. For a man who had spent his life as a symbol of power without ever truly holding it, there was something strangely fulfilling about nurturing life with his own hands. Despite his anonymity, the past was never far behind. He was a living relic of a vanished empire, a figure both fascinating and controversial. Some still saw him as a traitor, a collaborator with the Japanese who had betrayed China. Others pitied him, viewing him as a tragic victim of history, a man born into a role he never controlled. And for the Communist Party, he remained an example of successful reformation, a testament to the power of ideological transformation. The government ensured that he stayed on the right path. He was frequently called upon to speak publicly about his past, denouncing the Qing Dynasty, imperial rule, and his own past mistakes. Whether he truly believed in the party's teachings or simply accepted them as necessary for survival was a question that only he could answer. But he complied, understanding that his life depended on proving his loyalty to the new China. Outside of his work, Puyi lived a quiet personal life. His arranged marriage to Li Xuxian, a nurse with no ties to his imperial past, was another step in his reintegration into ordinary society. It was not a love story of passion or grandeur, but rather one of companionship and necessity. She cared for him, kept him grounded, and helped him navigate a world he had never been prepared for. For the first time in his life, he was not surrounded by courtiers or political manipulators, just an ordinary woman who expected nothing from him. Yet, even as he tried to live simply, he could not fully escape the weight of his history. Occasionally, he was recognized on the streets of Beijing. Some would approach him with curiosity, asking for stories of the Forbidden City, of emperors and eunuchs. Others looked at him with disdain, a reminder that, to many, he was still a symbol of a painful past. He never reacted with anger. Instead, he accepted his fate with quiet resignation, knowing that he would never truly be just another citizen. His health began to decline in the 1960s, the years of hardship and imprisonment taking their toll. As China underwent political upheavals, including the early tremors of the Cultural Revolution, Puyi remained on the margins, too insignificant to be a target, but too well known to be ignored entirely. The Red Guards, young revolutionaries devoted to Mao's vision, despised anything connected to the old world. For Puyi, this was a final, bitter irony. He had spent years proving his loyalty to the communist state, yet to some, he would always be an emperor, a remnant of a past that needed to be destroyed. As his health worsened, he spent more time reflecting on his past. He read books, revisited his own writings, and in rare moments of vulnerability, admitted his regrets. He had lived at the center of history, but had never controlled his own fate. From the Forbidden City to Manchukuo, from Soviet captivity to communist re-education, he had always been a pawn in the hands of greater forces. By the late 1960s, his body could no longer keep up with the world around him. His time as the last emperor of China was nearing its end. Part 13. Reflections on a Lost Empire. Puyi's Memoirs and Regrets. As Puyi entered the final years of his life, he found himself increasingly drawn to the past. Though he had spent decades shedding his imperial identity, the weight of history never truly left him. He was not just an ordinary citizen of the People's Republic. He was the last emperor of China, the final remnant of a dynasty that had ruled for nearly 3 centuries. And no matter how much he tried to forget, the world would not let him. In an effort to come to terms with his past, Puyi turned to writing. Under the guidance of the Communist Party, he began work on his memoirs, a detailed account of his life from the gilded halls of the Forbidden City to his years of re-education. The project was not entirely his own. Party officials carefully monitored his words, ensuring that his story aligned with the official narrative of transformation and redemption. But despite this oversight, the memoirs provided a rare window into his thoughts, his regrets, and his struggles to understand the forces that had shaped his destiny. The book, From Emperor to Citizen, was published in 1964 and became a widely read account of his life. In its pages, Puyi painted himself as a misguided figure, a man manipulated by those around him, from the Qing court to the Japanese military. He expressed regret for his role in Manchukuo, admitting that he had been blind to the suffering of his people and had allowed himself to be used by foreign powers. He spoke of his time in Soviet captivity and communist re-education, detailing how he had come to recognize the failures of his past. The party welcomed these admissions, seeing them as proof of their success in transforming even the most privileged figures of the old China. Yet beneath the political framing, there were glimpses of deeper reflection. He wrote of his childhood isolation, of the loneliness that had defined his life from the moment he was taken from his family and placed on the dragon throne. He described the suffocating rituals of the Qing court, where every movement was dictated by tradition and every decision made by others. He acknowledged the contradictions of his rule in Manchukuo, how he had simultaneously sought power and resented his own powerlessness. But perhaps most haunting were his reflections on the collapse of the empire itself. He had been crowned as a godlike figure, told that his rule was destined by heaven, yet within a few years, he had been cast aside as a relic of a bygone era. The Forbidden City, once the center of his world, had become a museum. The dynasty that had shaped him had vanished, leaving only its ruins. Despite the official success of his memoirs, not everyone accepted his version of events. Many in China still viewed him as a traitor, a man who had abandoned his people and collaborated with the Japanese. Others saw him as weak, a ruler who had never truly ruled, a puppet of every regime that had touched his life. And some questioned whether his transformation had been genuine. Was he truly reformed, or was he simply adapting to survive, as he always had. In his final years, Puyi tried to live quietly, avoiding political turmoil as China entered the chaos of the Cultural Revolution. He was too insignificant to be targeted directly, but his past still made him a figure of suspicion. The Red Guards, young revolutionaries who sought to purge remnants of the old world, saw him as an unwelcome symbol of China's imperial past. His apartment was searched, his belongings examined, and though he was not arrested, he knew that he would never fully escape the scrutiny of the state. As illness took hold of his body, Puyi knew his time was running out. He had spent his entire life navigating the currents of history, never truly in control, always caught between the forces of power, revolution, and survival. And now, as he looked back on it all, he could only wonder, had he ever truly been free? The last emperor of China was nearing the end of his journey. But even in death, his legacy would remain a subject of debate, controversy, and fascination. Part 14. The Death of Puyi, the End of an Era. By the late 1960s, Puyi's frail body could no longer withstand the weight of time. Decades of exile, imprisonment, and re-education had taken their toll, leaving him weakened and plagued by chronic illness. Once the ruler of the world's largest empire, he was now a fading figure in the shadows of communist China, living out his final days in quiet obscurity. Puyi suffered from kidney disease, hypertension, and heart complications, ailments worsened by the years of hardship he had endured. The former emperor, who had once been surrounded by attendants catering to his every need, now relied on his wife, Li Shuxian, for care. She remained by his side, ensuring that he took his medication and helping him navigate a world that had long since moved on from his rule. Unlike the lavish treatments he once received in the Forbidden City, his medical care was simple, dictated by the same state that had reshaped his life. In 1967, as the Cultural Revolution reached its peak, Puyi found himself in an increasingly hostile environment. The Red Guards, young revolutionaries devoted to Mao Zedong, sought to purge China of its feudal past, targeting intellectuals, former officials, and anyone associated with the old order. Though Puyi had spent years proving his loyalty to the communist state, to the radicals of the revolution, he remained a living relic of imperial rule. He had been reformed, yes, but to them he could never be truly cleansed of his past. Despite his frailty, Puyi was forced to endure public humiliation. Red Guards interrogated him, searching his apartment for any remnants of his imperial life. They found little. He had long since abandoned his past, but the mere fact of his existence was enough to make him a target. He was spared the worst of the violence, likely because of his symbolic value as a reformed figure, but he was never allowed to forget that he was still an outsider in the new China. By 1967, his health had deteriorated beyond recovery. He was admitted to the Beijing Railway Hospital, where doctors attempted to stabilize his condition. But there was little that could be done. His body was failing, and the weight of history pressed down on him in ways that no medicine could cure. He had survived the fall of an empire, exile, war, and re-education, but time was now his final adversary. On October 17, 1967, Puyi took his last breath. He died not as an emperor nor as a prisoner, but as an ordinary citizen of the People's Republic of China. There was no grand funeral, no mourning across the nation. His death was barely acknowledged by the state, and the world moved on as if he had never been the ruler of a great dynasty. The last emperor of China had passed into history, his departure as quiet and unremarkable as the final years of his life. His remains were cremated, and his ashes were initially placed at the Abdication Revolutionary Cemetery, a resting place for communist officials and reformists. In death, he had been fully absorbed into the system that had reshaped him. But decades later, in the 1990s, his ashes were moved to a more fitting location, next to the tombs of his Qing ancestors, reuniting him, at last, with the dynasty he had once ruled. Puyi's death marked more than just the end of a life. It was the closing chapter of an era that had shaped China for centuries. The imperial age had long since vanished, replaced by revolution and modernity. but his story remained a symbol of the profound transformations that had defined the 20th century. The last emperor was gone, but his legacy would continue to be debated, reinterpreted, and remembered, a lingering shadow over China's ever-changing identity. Part 15. Puyi's Legacy. The last emperor's place in history. Puyi's life was a paradox, a man born into absolute power, who spent his years searching for control over his own fate. He was the last emperor of China, yet he never truly ruled. He was a puppet of the Japanese, yet he never wielded real authority. He was re-educated by the communists, yet he never entirely escaped the weight of his imperial past. In the end, his story was not just about a fallen ruler, but about the transformation of an entire nation. For historians, Puyi remains one of the most complex figures of modern China. Some see him as a tragic victim of history, a boy emperor thrust into a crumbling dynasty, manipulated by warlords, foreign powers, and revolutionary forces. Others view him as a collaborator, a man who willingly aligned himself with the Japanese, allowing himself to be used as a tool in their imperial ambitions. And to the Communist Party, he was a symbol of successful reform, a privileged monarch who had been reshaped into a humble citizen of the new China. His memoirs, From Emperor to Citizen, played a crucial role in shaping his legacy. Published under state supervision, they framed his life as a journey of redemption, a misguided ruler who, through struggle and education, found his place among the people. Yet beyond the official narrative, his story remains one of deep contradictions. Did he truly believe in the communist ideals he later embraced, or was his transformation just another survival tactic? Had he ever truly been free to make his own choices, or had he always been a prisoner of circumstance? Despite his attempts to live an ordinary life in his later years, Puyi never fully faded from public consciousness. Over time, he became a subject of literature, films, and debates. The most famous portrayal came in 1987 with Bernardo Bertolucci's film The Last Emperor, which introduced his story to the world. The film painted him as a tragic figure, a man trapped by the shifting tides of history, unable to shape his own destiny. While the movie took artistic liberties, it captured the essence of his journey, one of grandeur, loss, and an endless search for belonging. Beyond the films and books, Puyi's legacy continues to be felt in modern China. The Forbidden City, once his childhood prison, now stands as a monument to the past, drawing millions of visitors each year. His brief reign remains a historical marker, the final moment of imperial rule before China was swept into the waves of revolution. And his life, with all its twists and contradictions, remains a reminder of how history can shape a person, even as they struggle to define themselves. His final resting place near the tombs of his ancestors serves as a fitting conclusion to his journey. Though he lived most of his life as an exile from his own empire, from Manchukuo, from Soviet captivity, and from the Forbidden City, he was ultimately returned to the dynasty that had shaped his identity. In death, he was no longer a puppet, no longer a prisoner, no longer a reformed citizen, just a man who had lived through the fall of an empire. Puyi was the last emperor of China. But his story is not just about an empire's end. It is about survival, transformation, and the enduring question of what it means to belong in a world that is constantly changing. His name will never be forgotten, not as a ruler nor as a prisoner, but as a man who lived through history itself. Thanks for tuning into Historical Legacies. If you enjoyed this dive into history, please like, subscribe, and share. Join us next time for more fascinating stories from the past.